When Rebecca's boss, the arrogant and manipulative Mr. Caldwell, steals her $150,000 inheritance, he expects her to stay silent and powerless. But he has no idea who he's messed with. Fueled by betrayal and desperation, Rebecca uncovers years of Caldwell's corruption, from tax fraud to offshore accounts and shady dealings with dangerous people. As she meticulously dismantles his empire, her revenge spirals into a high-stakes game when she learns his crimes involve powerful individuals who now see her as a target. What begins as a quest for justice turns into a battle for survival, as Rebecca discovers that the price of revenge may be higher than she ever imagined. I always believed that hard work and loyalty could fix anything. I clung to that belief for years, working tirelessly for Mr. Caldwell, the owner of a small, family-run company. It wasn't a glamorous job by any stretch of the imagination, but it paid the bills and kept food on the table for my son, Ethan, and me. Life wasn't easy as a single mom, but I made it work. Little did I know, my boss, the man I trusted with my livelihood, was about to rob me of the one thing that could have changed everything. The day my mom passed away was one of the hardest days of my life. She'd been sick for a while, but that didn't make it any easier to say goodbye. She was my rock, my sounding board, and my best friend. Losing her left a hole in my heart, but her passing also came with an unexpected gift, an inheritance. I wasn't expecting much, but when her lawyer called me in to review the will, I learned that my mom had left me her small house and a life insurance payout of $150,000. To most people, it wouldn't seem like a fortune, but to me, it was everything. It meant I could pay off the credit card debt that had been haunting me for years, start a college fund for Ethan, and maybe, just maybe, quit my miserable job to find something better. The weeks after the funeral were a blur of paperwork, grief, and trying to keep Ethan's spirits up. I kept the news about the inheritance mostly to myself, though I did mention it once at work during a lunch break. It was an offhand comment, something about waiting for the insurance payout to clear. My co-workers nodded sympathetically and moved on with their own conversations, but apparently, someone had been listening a little too closely. A few days later, Mr. Caldwell called me into his office. His usual smug expression was plastered across his face, but there was something different in his tone, something too friendly, almost slimy. "I heard about your loss, Rebecca," he began, leaning back in his oversized leather chair. "I'm sorry to hear about your mother. She was a wonderful woman, wasn't she?" His words felt hollow, rehearsed. My mom had never met him, and I doubted he even knew her name. Still, I nodded politely, unsure where the conversation was going. "I also heard," he continued, "that she left you a little something. An inheritance?" The room suddenly felt smaller, tighter. I shifted uncomfortably in my chair, my instincts already warning me that something wasn't right. "Yeah," I replied cautiously. "It's been helpful, especially with everything going on." He smiled, a fake, oily smile that made my stomach churn. "You're lucky," he said. "Not everyone gets an opportunity like that. That kind of money can change a person's life." I nodded again, unsure of what to say. The conversation ended shortly after, and I walked out of his office feeling uneasy, though I couldn't quite put my finger on why. At the time, I thought he was just being his usual nosy self. I had no idea he was setting the stage for what would become the most infuriating betrayal of my life. Weeks passed, and I kept waiting for the insurance check to clear. Every time I called the company, they assured me it was in process, but the delays made no sense. It was frustrating, but I figured it was just the typical bureaucracy that came with anything involving insurance companies. I had no reason to suspect otherwise, until I overheard something that changed everything. It was a Friday afternoon, and I was staying late at work to finish up some paperwork. Most of the staff had already left for the day, but Mr. Caldwell was still in his office. His door was slightly ajar, and as I passed by on my way to the copier, I caught a snippet of his conversation. "Yeah, the check cleared," he said. "I transferred it to the business account. She won't even notice." I froze in my tracks, my heart pounding in my chest. Was he talking about me? My money? I strained to hear more, but his voice dropped, and I couldn't make out the rest of the conversation. Panic bubbled up inside me as I rushed back to my desk, trying to make sense of what I'd just heard. The thought seemed impossible, unthinkable. How could he have accessed my money? But the more I thought about it, the more the pieces started to fall into place. He knew about the inheritance. He had connections everywhere, including the bank I used. And he'd always been the type of person who thought he could get away with anything. The next morning, I called the bank and asked them to verify the status of my insurance payout. The woman on the other end of the line hesitated for a moment before confirming my worst fear. The check had been cashed, by Mr. Caldwell. My hands shook as I hung up the phone. I felt a mix of rage and helplessness. He'd stolen my money, the one thing that could have made my life better, and he thought he could get away with it. By Monday morning, I was ready for a confrontation. I stormed into his office without knocking, slamming the door behind me. He looked up from his desk, startled but quickly regaining his composure. "Rebecca," he said calmly, "what's the matter?" "You know what's the matter," I snapped. "You stole my money. My mom's money. How could you do that?" He didn't even try to deny it. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, that same smug smile on his face. "It's not stealing," he said. "Think of it as an investment. The company's been struggling, and this money will help us get back on track. You'll get it back eventually, probably with interest." My jaw dropped. "Are you serious? That money wasn't yours to take." "Relax," he said, waving a hand dismissively. "You're overreacting. You'll thank me later when the company is thriving again." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. When I threatened to go to the police, his smirk only widened. "Go ahead," he said. "You don't have the money for a lawyer, and even if you did, this would drag on for years. By the time it's over, the money will be long gone. Face it, you're stuck." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. He was right about one thing: I didn't have the resources to fight him in court. But he underestimated me in one crucial way: I wasn't the type to give up, not when my family's future was on the line. As I walked out of his office, his laughter echoing behind me, a fire lit inside me. He thought I was powerless, but I wasn't. I'd worked for him for years, and I knew his business better than anyone. I knew his secrets, his shortcuts, and his lies. If he wanted to play dirty, so could I. That weekend, I sat at my kitchen table, staring at the stack of bills I had hoped to pay off with my inheritance. The credit card statements, overdue utilities, and medical expenses from Ethan's asthma treatments mocked me. The weight of it all was suffocating, but the rage simmering inside me burned hotter than my despair. Mr. Caldwell thought he'd gotten away with it, he thought I had no way out. But he didn't know what I was capable of. I spent that Saturday night poring over everything I knew about Caldwell and his company. For years, I had been the quiet, dependable employee, the one who stayed late, who cleaned up everyone else's messes, and who knew every detail of the company's operations. If there was one thing I had in my favor, it was this: I knew where all the skeletons were buried. I started with the accounting system. As the office manager, I had access to a lot more than most employees, and I'd always known Mr. Caldwell was cutting corners. He used shady practices to dodge taxes, overbilled clients whenever he could, and kept a separate set of books to hide the true state of the company's finances. I had ignored it for years because I needed the paycheck and didn't want to rock the boat. But now, I saw it as my opportunity. The first thing I did was comb through the financial records for proof of the theft. It didn't take long to find it: a direct transfer from the insurance company to the company's account, flagged as business income. My name was nowhere on the transaction, but I had emails from the insurance company proving the check was meant for me. That was just the beginning. As I dug deeper, I found more dirt than I'd ever expected. There were offshore accounts I'd never noticed before, transactions marked with cryptic codes, and payments to shell companies I couldn't trace. It was clear Mr. Caldwell had been skimming money off the top for years, stashing it away where no one could find it. I felt a sick satisfaction as I collected the evidence. Every screenshot, every spreadsheet, every damning email went into a secure folder on my laptop. I wasn't entirely sure what I was going to do with it yet, but I knew one thing for certain: I wasn't going to let him get away with this. The next step was more personal. I started reaching out to former employees, people who had left the company under questionable circumstances. There was Sarah, a talented marketing director who had been abruptly fired after a fight with Caldwell. And Jeff, the IT guy who had quit after accusing Caldwell of refusing to pay him for overtime. They were more than happy to talk, and what they told me only confirmed what I already suspected: Mr. Caldwell was a liar, a cheat, and a thief. I always knew he was dirty, Sarah said during our phone call. He fired me because I caught him inflating invoices to clients. I should have reported him back then, but I didn't want to deal with the legal mess. Jeff had his own story. He used to make me set up fake emails to send inflated bids to competitors, he said. The guy's been scamming people for years. I wouldn't be surprised if the whole company's a house of cards. Their stories gave me more than just validation, they gave me ammunition. I asked them if they'd be willing to provide statements if I needed them, and they agreed without hesitation. It felt good to know I wasn't alone in this fight. The final piece of the puzzle came when I started reaching out to Mr. Caldwell's clients. At first, I was nervous about contacting them, worried they'd ignore me or report me back to him. But most of them were surprisingly receptive, especially when I presented the evidence of overbilling. I knew something didn't add up, one of the clients said after reviewing the documents I sent. He's been overcharging us for years. Thank you for bringing this to my attention. By the end of the week, 2 major clients had pulled their contracts. I didn't feel guilty about it, not after what he'd done to me. I wasn't just trying to get even anymore, I was trying to make sure he couldn't do this to anyone else. But as satisfying as it was to see cracks forming in his empire, I knew this wasn't enough. I needed to hit him where it hurt the most: his money. One night, after putting Ethan to bed, I logged back into the accounting system. I knew the passwords, the shortcuts, the way he hid transactions he didn't want anyone else to see. It didn't take long to find his offshore accounts. There were 3 of them, each holding hundreds of thousands of dollars. The money wasn't stolen from me, but it was stolen nonetheless, from clients, from employees, from the government. I couldn't take the money back for myself, that would make me no better than him, but I knew exactly what to do with it. I drafted a detailed report, outlining every shady transaction, every hidden account, and every lie. Then I sent it to the IRS, along with an anonymous tip about tax evasion. The next morning, I walked into the office feeling a strange mix of fear and exhilaration. I wasn't sure how long it would take for the fallout to begin, but I knew it was coming. Sure enough, by the end of the week, Mr. Caldwell was panicking. "What's going on?" I overheard him ask his assistant. "Why is the IRS asking for our financial records?" I bit back a smile as I walked past his office. He had no idea it was me. Not yet, anyway. But I wasn't done. The evidence I'd collected wasn't just for the IRS, I also sent it to the clients he'd scammed, the vendors he'd underpaid, and the local authorities. If Caldwell thought he was untouchable, he was about to learn otherwise. By the end of the month, the cracks in his company had turned into full-blown fractures. The IRS froze his accounts, his clients stopped payments, and rumors of his shady practices began spreading through the industry. Watching his empire crumble was more satisfying than I ever imagined, but I knew the final blow was still to come. I wasn't just going to ruin his business, I was going to make sure he paid for what he did to me. And when the time came, he'd have no one to blame but himself. By the time the fallout started gaining momentum, I realized there was no turning back. The train had left the station, and I was driving it straight into Mr. Caldwell's world of lies. Every step of the way, I told myself this was justice, that I wasn't just avenging my stolen inheritance, but standing up for every person he had cheated, manipulated, and exploited. But deep down, I knew a part of me was doing this out of sheer spite. He thought I was weak. He thought I was powerless. And I was determined to show him just how wrong he was. It didn't take long for the walls to start closing in on him. The IRS audit escalated quickly, freezing not only the company's accounts but also his personal ones. That meant no more secret offshore transfers, no more tax-dodging shell companies. His money, the same money he had hoarded for years by screwing over others, was officially out of his reach. But that wasn't all. Clients started pulling out faster than he could keep up. A few of his biggest contracts, the ones that kept the business afloat, sent formal notices demanding refunds for the overbilling. Some even threatened lawsuits. One by one, the phone calls came in, each one hammering another nail into the coffin of Caldwell Enterprises. I stayed quiet, watching it all unfold from the sidelines. By this point, I had no intention of keeping my job. I didn't need the paycheck anymore, I was just biding my time, waiting for the right moment to walk away. And as satisfying as it was to see him scramble, I still hadn't delivered the final blow. That's when I remembered something I had almost forgotten in my rush to gather evidence. Years ago, during one of my late nights at the office, Mr. Caldwell had asked me to fix some paperwork for him. He was trying to get a bank loan, and he needed the financials to look better than they actually were. I had reluctantly adjusted the numbers for him back then, not realizing what I was really doing. Now, it made perfect sense. He had falsified loan applications. If I could prove it, it wouldn't just ruin him financially, it would land him in prison. I spent hours searching through old records, digging up files I hadn't looked at in years. Sure enough, I found everything I needed, emails from him instructing me to manipulate the numbers, copies of the fake financial statements, and even a paper trail showing how he used the loan money to cover personal expenses. This was it. This was the evidence that would seal his fate. I compiled everything into a neat little package, complete with timestamps and annotations, and sent it off to the bank. I knew they'd have no choice but to report it to the authorities. Fraud on that scale wasn't something they could sweep under the rug. A week later, the consequences hit like an avalanche. I was sitting at my desk when two men in dark suits walked into the office. They flashed their badges to Caldwell's assistant and asked to see him immediately. Within minutes, he was being escorted out of his office, his face pale and his hands trembling. He tried to maintain his usual arrogance, but I could see the cracks in his facade. He knew why they were there. The entire office fell silent as the men led him outside, where a squad car was waiting. I watched from the window as they cuffed him and placed him in the back seat. It was surreal. This man, who had always acted like he was untouchable, was finally being held accountable for his actions. For a moment, I felt a pang of guilt. Was this too much? Had I gone too far? But then I thought about Ethan, about the sleepless nights I'd spent worrying about how to make ends meet, about the blatant disrespect Caldwell had shown me when he stole my money and laughed in my face. No, this wasn't too far. This was exactly what he deserved. The office descended into chaos after his arrest. No one knew what to do or who to turn to. The accounts were frozen, the clients were gone, and now the boss was in jail. Some of my coworkers tried to rally together, but it was clear the company wasn't going to survive. That evening, I handed in my resignation. I had no intention of staying until the bitter end. I had already done what I needed to do, and it was time to move on. As I walked out of the building for the last time, I felt a strange mix of emotions, relief, satisfaction, and a twinge of sadness for the coworkers who had nothing to do with Caldwell's crimes but would inevitably suffer the fallout. Still, I knew this wasn't over. I wasn't just trying to destroy his company, I wanted my money back. And that meant taking him to court. The lawsuit was a gamble. I didn't have the funds to hire a high-powered lawyer, but I didn't need one. The evidence I had collected was airtight, and after everything Caldwell had done, I was confident I could win. The trial dragged on for months. Caldwell's lawyers tried every trick in the book to delay the proceedings, but it was no use. Between the stolen inheritance, the fraudulent loans, and the tax evasion, the case against him was overwhelming. In the end, the judge ruled in my favor. Not only was I awarded my original $150,000 inheritance, but the court also granted me an additional $300,000 in damages. It was more money than I had ever dreamed of having, and it was all thanks to Caldwell's arrogance. But the real victory wasn't the money. The real victory was seeing him lose everything: the business, the wealth, the respect he had spent years cultivating. He went from being a smug, untouchable businessman to a disgraced convict, all because he thought he could take advantage of me and get away with it. I walked out of the courthouse that day with my head held high. The fight had been long and exhausting, but it was worth it. For the first time in years, I felt free. I sold my mom's house shortly after the trial, using the money to pay off my debts and start fresh. I even set aside a chunk of the settlement for Ethan's college fund. Life wasn't perfect, it never is, but it was better. And every time I thought about Caldwell, sitting in a prison cell, I couldn't help but smile. He thought I was powerless, but I proved him wrong. And I made sure he'd never hurt anyone else the way he hurt me. The months following Mr. Caldwell's downfall were the calmest I had experienced in years. With my debts paid off and a comfortable cushion in the bank, I finally had the chance to focus on rebuilding my life. I spent more time with Ethan, picked up new hobbies, and even started researching how to open my own business. Life was finally good, or so I thought. But as the saying goes, the devil you know is better than the devil you don't. And just when I thought I was done with Caldwell for good, his ghost came back to haunt me, this time in a way I could never have expected. It all started with an envelope that arrived one afternoon, just as I was getting ready to pick Ethan up from school. There was no return address, only my name scrawled in a hurried, almost desperate hand. Curious, I opened it and found a single folded sheet of paper inside. The letter was short, but every word hit me like a gut punch. Rebecca. You think you've won, but you have no idea what you've gotten yourself into. The money I took wasn't just for the company, it was for people far more powerful than me. People who don't forgive easily. They're watching you now. Be careful. Caldwell. My hands trembled as I read the note over and over, trying to make sense of it. Was this a threat? A desperate attempt to intimidate me from behind bars? Or was there more to this than I realized? I didn't want to believe him, but a sick feeling began to grow in the pit of my stomach. Caldwell had always been shady, but what if he wasn't lying? What if the stolen money wasn't just about his greed, but part of something much bigger? The next few weeks were a blur of paranoia. At first, I tried to dismiss the letter as the ramblings of a desperate man, but strange things began happening that I couldn't ignore. One evening, as I was leaving the grocery store, I noticed a black SUV parked across the street. I wouldn't have thought much of it, except I'd seen the same vehicle earlier that day, idling near Ethan's school. The driver was just a shadowy figure behind tinted windows, but I couldn't shake the feeling I was being watched. Another time, I came home to find my mailbox open and rifled through. Nothing was missing, but the invasion felt deliberate, like a warning. The breaking point came when I noticed an envelope tucked under my windshield wiper. Inside was a single photo of Ethan playing in our backyard. No message, no signature, just the image of my son, a silent reminder that whoever was behind this knew exactly where to hurt me. Panicked, I called the police and filed a report, but there wasn't much they could do. "We'll keep an eye out," the officer said, but the look on his face told me not to expect much. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake, clutching Ethan tightly as he slept, my mind racing through every possibility. If Caldwell's letter was true, then I had inadvertently stirred up something far more dangerous than I'd ever imagined. Desperate for answers, I decided to visit Caldwell in prison. I didn't want to see him again, but I needed to know the truth. What had I gotten myself into? When I arrived at the prison, Caldwell looked like a shadow of the man he used to be. His once perfectly styled hair was disheveled, his suit replaced by a baggy orange jumpsuit. But the moment he saw me, a smirk spread across his face, as if he had been expecting me. Well, well, he drawled, leaning back in his chair. Rebecca. To what do I owe the pleasure? I didn't waste time with pleasantries. What the hell is going on, Caldwell? What did you mean in your letter? Who's watching me? His smirk faltered, just for a moment, but it was enough to tell me he was hiding something. I told you, he said, his tone serious now. The money I took wasn't just for me. I owed people, dangerous people. When I couldn't pay them back, I used your inheritance as a last-ditch effort to save my skin. And when you blew everything up, you put a target on your back. They don't care about me anymore, they care about the money. And now, they're looking at you. My stomach turned. Who are they? What do they want from me? He leaned forward, lowering his voice. They're investors. Loan sharks. Let's just say they're not the kind of people you want to piss off. They think you still have the money, and until they get it, they'll keep coming for you. I felt the blood drain from my face. But I don't have it anymore. I paid off my debts, set aside some for my son's future. I don't have what they're looking for. Caldwell shrugged, his expression cold. Doesn't matter. They don't care about your excuses. They only care about getting what's theirs. And trust me, they'll find a way to collect, one way or another. I left the prison in a daze, my mind spinning with fear and anger. How could he do this to me? How could he drag me into his mess without a second thought? For weeks, I tried to carry on with life as usual, but the paranoia never went away. The black SUV reappeared, always lingering just out of reach. The anonymous notes became more frequent, each one more threatening than the last. And then, one evening, I came home to find my front door ajar. My heart pounded as I stepped inside, clutching a kitchen knife I'd grabbed from the car. The house was eerily silent, but it was clear someone had been there. Drawers were pulled open, papers were scattered across the floor, and the lock on my safe had been tampered with. Whoever they were, they hadn't taken anything, this time. But the message was clear, they could get to me whenever they wanted. Terrified, I packed a bag for Ethan and me that night and left town without telling anyone. I didn't know where we were going or how long we'd be gone, but I knew one thing for certain, I couldn't let them find us. Months later, as I sat in a dingy motel room far from home, I found myself scrolling through news headlines. One article caught my eye, former business mogul found dead in prison cell, apparent suicide. I stared at the screen, my hands trembling. Caldwell was gone. But as much as I wanted to believe this nightmare was over, I knew better. The people he owed wouldn't just disappear. And now, they thought I had what was theirs. I closed my laptop and looked at Ethan, asleep on the bed beside me. I had destroyed Caldwell, but in doing so, I'd inherited his enemies. My revenge had set something in motion that couldn't be undone. I thought I'd won. I thought I'd gotten justice. But the truth was, this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning.